Hello, this is Michael Reed Dimmock, and you're listening to Flipping the Table, a podcast featuring honest conversations and brief commentaries about the future of food and farming. I'm inspired by the thousands of farmers, ranchers, entrepreneurs, activists, and policymakers across this nation who are meeting the many challenges related to nutrition, poverty, pollution, and climate. This podcast highlights the people and actions making our planet and communities healthier and more resilient. I hope to inspire listeners to use their food purchases and their votes, our democracy, to flip the table in support of a new and better food system for us all, to be part of the delicious revolution now underway. The Farm Bill is probably the most important federal law that people have never heard of. It is a complex 1,000-page set of rules that govern the way we, the taxpayers, spend $100 billion each year on payments to farmers for food stamps, conservation, research, and rural economic development. My guest today, Dan Imhoff, is an author, small-scale farmer, and musician who has spent 15 years studying and writing about and advocating for transformation of this critical law. He does us this service by making the many acronyms, programs, and policies understandable to the average concerned eater, with a concise analysis and dynamic graphics in his book, The Farm Bill, A Citizen's Guide, recently released in its third edition and widely utilized at campuses across the United States. Dan has also extensively written and edited essays about industrial meat production, most notably in the shocking graphic tabletop book about concentrated animal feeding operations titled CAFO, The Tragedy of Industrial Animal Factories, which was published and distributed in 2010 and 11. If that book was about the ugliest underbelly of industrial agriculture, he has also written about its beauty. In his book, Farming and the Fate of Wild Nature, published in 2006, and then in Farming with the Wild in 2013. That later book profiles 20 farmers and ranchers that work with nature rather than against her. Welcome, Dan.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So you've described yourself as a reluctant wonk, referring to your focus on the Farm Bill. So please tell us, why you've dedicated so many hours of research, writing, traveling, and speaking on the Farm Bill.
Well, I say that I'm a reluctant wonk because I definitely do not get out of bed burning to just get right into food and farm policy. I have plants and animals to take care of. I have a music practice to nurture and other things to do. But as a communicator, as a writer over many years, I've always been looking for intervention points into big societal problems. And when it comes to food and agriculture, you look at the $100 billion that are spent every year on nutrition and farming and conservation practices, and you can't not see that as this tremendous opportunity to influence how we eat and how we produce food and care for the land.
So it's a change lever.
It's a lever of change, absolutely. Yeah.
So let's talk for our listeners about the origins of the Farm Bill, just so people understand the trajectory of its evolution over time, what its original intention was, and how you see it today.
Well, let's go to the history first, because when you're looking at the Farm Bill, and for me as a researcher and as a writer, it's the early days of the Farm Bill that are really the most exciting and juicy. And it's the 1930s. The stock market has crashed. We're having this massive change in our culture from a rural culture to an urban culture, from an agricultural culture to an industrial one. For many decades now, this change has been underway, and the crisis has really hit the rural communities because their income is not keeping up with the industrializing, urbanizing income, and so they're falling farther and farther behind.
Didn't the farm crisis begin in the 20s, actually, late 20s?
I think it was going on for, cycles, boom and bust cycles for a long time. But absolutely. I mean, the thing is that the farmers really had only one mechanism to try to get ahead, which was to plant more. And so they planted more and more. They went into areas that never should have been planted. The more they harvested, the lower the prices went. And then finally, you had this crisis of drought and flood and the Dust Bowl, and the whole thing just, completely disintegrated. And at a time in the 1930s, the price of corn was zero. So it was a crisis of overproduction. And that's the crisis that we're still dealing with today, is that, the farmers are trying to just flood the market, but in doing so, prices fall. And so how do you make up that difference? How do you get the farmers a fair price, especially when the economics of nature are not compatible with the economics of Wall Street? And so enter the government that says, wow, we have this serious problem. The soil is blowing away. The farmers have no markets.
Starving.
One out of three people is unemployed. There's massive starvation and underemployment. And so in came the New Deal, and the Farm Bill was a really one of the pillars of the New Deal.
Yeah, and let's talk about that because it's I forget the name of the book, but it was written about Wallace. Actually, I think you were the one that suggested I read it.
American Dreamer?
American Dreamer. In that book, there's a great section about how the Farm Bill got written so quickly. Can you just share with, because I think it's an incredible moment in history. It shows how people can respond to great tragedy and great dislocation in a moment.
Well, it's really important because Wallace came from a family of secretaries of agriculture. I believe his grandfather was a secretary of agriculture, as was his father, and then him. I could be wrong about the grandfather. And so, they were farmers. They were from Iowa.
Right.
They had a publication,
Mm-hmm.
a
farming
publication, and Wallace was a extraordinary person who went on to become the vice president and almost the president. I mean, instead of Truman. I mean, he was just nearly there. So you had a really big mind in the Department of Agriculture. And, one of the things that they tried to say was, okay, there is a role for government in agriculture, but in return, those agriculturalists who are going to get subsidies are going to give something back. So they had to have a conservation plan for their farm. They had supply management, so they had to have a certain amount of their farm that was out of production, therefore protecting against erosion, but also hedging against oversupply.
Yeah, keeping prices high.
And in return, they had a guaranteed market. So there was a mechanism to try to get parity. Economic parity, income parity for the farmers.
I want to just go back for 1 second because one of the things I do remember in that book is that Felix Frankfurter, I think one of the later became a Supreme Court justice, helped draft the Farm Bill. There was like a skunk works of really smart people Wallace put in a room for like 3 weeks, and they actually hammered the bill out.
And it was super highly controversial. I mean, there were a lot of forces against it for anti-commerce, and it was
socialistic.
Yes, exactly, and it was completely socialistic. And if you look at it today and you say it's not socialistic, then I'm not exactly sure what lens you're possibly looking through, because this is government money that's going to private individuals who are participating in the market.
Mm-hmm. It's social. It's taxpayer money.
It's taxpayer money, and so and I think those were the golden years, because you had someone so incredibly smart in the highest realm of agriculture and land use and nutrition assistance. And they were really just trying things, and it was a great experimentation, but they weren't just giving away taxpayer money. But and it was always controversial, and the farmers always resented that that people would get food stamps, that they would get assistance for food, even while they were getting assistance for farming. And I mean that's a rub that goes way back.
And I think you could just describe, I mean, it's gotten more complex over time, but the big elements were the nutrition piece, the conservation piece, and the supply management piece. Were those the three big pieces? Was there any more?
No, I think that was, maybe I'm missing something. I imagine that Aldo Leopold, the great conservation philosopher of the United States, was involved in the earliest conservation farm bill programs. So he was working in Wisconsin, and in this watershed that had completely collapsed, and he was helping out in drafting these programs that would enroll farmers in new practices, not plowing on slopes over a certain inclination, and putting back in fences, and restoring wood lots, and certain strips, cover strips, and things like this. Prairie stripping
to stop erosion.
That would stop erosion on the hillside farming, and also to take biological inventory throughout farmland, and for many reasons, for hunting, so that there was kind of this robust rural wild interface, but also really to look at the farm as a place where conservation took place. Like he was all about biotic farming, where a good farm is a place where the native fauna and flora have lost acreage without losing existence. So there was this real conservation ethic. As a farmer, your duty was to protect nature, as well as grow crops, and that was a big part of the philosophy back then. That's the one thing that interests me in the Farm Bill, is how can it be used to incentivize and empower the landowner to protect biodiversity, protect the natural world that really belongs to all of us. That, to me, that's the contract. That's the social contract, and it's the social contract which has just been torn away over the many decades since the early years.
Yeah. Okay. So we're going to come back to this, because this is the holy grail, that the ideal that I know you and many others are interested in seeing, myself included. But I want to go back to. So it started in a certain way. It actually met the challenge of the day in the 1930s. It had a positive impact. The farm economy turned around. But it didn't last. As the New York Times pointed out, I think it was in December, actually, there was a special piece. I saw it in the front page of the magazine, I believe. It said that basically many economists have given up on even theorizing how rural economies can be brought back or included in the modern American economy. So the Farm Bill was meant as a safety net. It worked for a while, but is not working now. So describe for everybody what is broken. Why is it such a disaster?
Well, imagine that there were 6 million family farms around the 1930s. So the times of the early farm bills, we still had this family farm economy, and the farms weren't that large. They were very diverse depending on where you were, but you had you had a diversity of crops that kind of went into the commodity market, but then they also went to local markets, and then they also fed your family and your and your town. And it wasn't just that the Farm Bill got us, succeeded to get us through the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. It was also that World War II was over. And then suddenly, this huge engine of fighting a war suddenly went back into a civilian economy, and the United States ended up with a huge amount of the money in the world by staying out of the war for a couple years. And so now you had this, just this huge thrust of commerce in America. And the farm changed between the 30s and I want to say 2000. We went from 6 million family farms to about 2 million family farms, of which about 300,000 produced the most commodities. And we just went through this huge consolidation and expansion and extreme. What's the word? Concentration? No. I mean that farms became very, very precise. They were no longer
industrial systems.
Yeah, and narrowly focused. When you used to have a couple hogs or 50 hogs and little orchard and little of this and this.
They were diversified, and now they're not.
Yes, exactly. And so agriculture just completely changed, and so did the farm. And
was that policy, or was that
specialized? Is the word that I'm trying to say. And so everyone became a specialist, and you're suddenly just a corn farmer, and then you're suddenly just one of a few 100,000 corn farmers that are just producing 100 million acres, in these huge monocultures. And you also had a lot of technologies that also went with that transition. The chemicals that they used for war became chemicals that they used for agriculture, and the machines that they used for war, including planes and tanks and things, became the tractors and the combines and the crop dusting infrastructure for this new industrial agriculture. And so the Farm Bill evolved to serve it. And
did it shape it or did it serve it?
I think it served it. It served it, and then eventually shaped it. Once
I think about Earl Butz and his admonition.
Yeah. So by the late 50s and the late 60s, agriculture was becoming really, really specialized and big and industrial, and the government was also seeing it as a way out of trade imbalances and to use
grain production
in order to balance our imports and exports.
And actually,
trade.
agriculture has been, traditionally it's one of the strongest export sectors of the U.S. economy has been agriculture, because we have this huge natural asset called the Great Midwestern Plains that produces all this grain.
And one of the big tragedies of it, in my humble opinion, is that the wild borders, the things that Leopold and the early conservationists working in early Farm Bill programs were trying to introduce into the farm as a buffer against erosion, as a buffer against overproduction, as a way to keep the natural world healthy and abundant, they were eventually abandoned. And then all of a sudden, the conservation programs were used to drain wetlands so farms could get bigger, to tile fields so, low-lying wet areas could be plowed earlier and earlier. They basically made a sewer system throughout the entire Midwest, thousands and thousands of miles long at taxpayer expense. And as this get big or get out movement.
Which was Earl Butz, who was the Secretary of Agriculture under, was it Nixon?
In the Butz administration, yeah. Then, they just started to serve bigger and bigger interests. And eventually they dismantled the supply management programs, and the farmer just became a producer in a world of global competition, which was a race for the bottom.
Yeah, and that's interesting because that change that took place between really the late 50s or 60s into the 80s, that period, that 25, 30-year period, whatever it was, where that transformation occurred, that was the beginning of the great hollowing out of the Midwest. I was just reviewing that article in the New York Times I mentioned, and there are now 50 million Americans in the rural regions of the United States who are considered under severe economic stress. Because jobs have been eliminated by industrial systems. The people are leaving, but they also have we have the highest incidence of opioid addiction in the rural regions. We've got suicides. We've got bankruptcies. I mean, if you drive California, the Central Valley, you drive up and down 99 or 5, you can see what's happened to the cities from when I was a kid. I mean, it's much different. Those were vital communities. Now there's a lot of empty buildings on every square in every town. And so that's a manifestation of this failure of federal policy to meet the needs.
And you could just look at farming kind of like what happened to retail in rural areas. Everything just became eventually big box retail. It started with little malls and Kmart and Sears, and then it ended up with Walmart and Amazon, and that's really pretty much what's happened with small farms. They got bigger and bigger and bought out and consolidated until they're just this kind of big force that is really having a huge impact on rural America.
Okay, so I'm interested in your thoughts on, what is the boundary between the federal policy and larger global economic forces at work? You know what I'm saying? I think you're touching on it here. It's not just the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill is part of the problem, but isn't it?
Well, one of those boundaries is the World Trade Organization, because there are rules of trade, and when you're talking about agriculture kind of simplistically, there are certain things that the World Trade Organization allows. You can spend as much money as you want to support green payments, to support conservation efforts on the farm. But what you can't support over a certain level are subsidies that directly impact the price of something that's going to be exported. I mean, and when you look at cotton, let's say, once a really, really big crop. I think it's smaller than it ever has been, but still a really important commodity through the Farm Bill, and for U.S. agriculture. I mean, there practically are no cotton mills in the United States anymore. There were in the 20th century, but they're gone. So cotton is basically an export price. And so if you start to impact the price by supporting with farm supports.
Subsidies.
Yeah, subsidies that allow a producer to sell the crop for less than the cost of production, then that starts to negatively impact growers in other countries, tons of countries actually, where they're producing small-scale cotton without subsidies. And so the border, kind of for how subsidies affect global markets is definitely there, where our subsidized, highly industrialized agriculture kind of unfairly competes with smallholder farmers throughout the world who don't have the same benefit.
And that Farm Bill has tried to respond to that, because they no longer really call it subsidies, but what they're doing is they're subsidizing insurance, correct? I mean, is it a sleight of hand? Are they're basically still doing price supports, but this has always seemed kind of crazy to me that we're subsidizing farmers who are farming in ways that are not truly sustainable. We're paying for their insurance, so if their crop fails, the public pays for that.
I call it permanent disaster assistance. Basically. Okay, so in the late 90s, the Republican held Congress. It was run by Newt Gingrich. It was led by Gingrich. They made this attempt to just phase out subsidies altogether. It was called Freedom to Farm, and they started to just give you money based on your acreage and your past harvest. And they said, okay, for these next few years, we're going to totally abandon our supply management programs. We're going to phase out our commodity supports. And after, the next farm bill, we're done.
You're a free market.
We're done. Yeah, this is going to be the free market. Let's see how that works. And it didn't work well at all. And
the farm crisis, right?
Yeah, it was an incredible farm crisis of overproduction again. And the prices went way, way, way down. And suddenly the government had to keep farmers afloat, or to keep the whole financial structure of agriculture afloat. They started to put in these yearly disaster payments, and they were big. I mean, we were talking, 12 billion, 15 billion, 20 billion, 25 billion for corn and soybeans. And
because the economies of the Midwest will collapse without that money, right? The insurance companies, the retailers, all the systems, the hospitals.
And it's hard to victimize the farmer, because a lot of this money just goes right into the financial
banks,
mechanisms,
right? The
that
loans.
keep the whole thing going. All the loans, the equipment, the seed, the inputs,
the chemicals,
everything. And so in early 2002 Farm Bill, they changed those programs to direct payments. And so you would get a direct payment based on, again, the history of your property and your cropping and income. And
but that's a subsidy.
It was a subsidy. It was a direct payment and I mean, you could get payment just because you had the land and you didn't even farm it. It was a payment based, tied to land. It was like almost feudal,
Well, that's very socialistic, isn't it?
and so then again, it was still promoting overproduction, and you had many years until the big ethanol boom in like 2007, 2008. There was still overproduction and low prices and permanent paying out of disaster assistance. And I remember during the first food fight book that I did, I came across this study, this map from the Environmental Working Group, and it was this map of, agriculture, the United States, where farmers received disaster payments in 1 out of every 2 years over a 20-year period. And the entire Midwest and down to the Texas Panhandle was just totally black, right? So 1 out of every 2 years, they're having some kind of crop failure, or income shortage. So now what we've gone to is a taxpayer-funded crop insurance program where you're guaranteed income, and it's incredible. Like there's no limit to how much crop insurance benefits you can get. There are very few environmental requirements to enroll in the program. They're tweaking them a little bit, but really it's just supporting overproduction permanently now.
And you're talking about the 2018, 2019 Farm Bill that was just passed in December.
Yeah. But they have gone, direct payments are no longer. And it has completely shifted to this crop insurance program. But disaster payments are totally on the table. And what's ironic to me, and should be ironic to most people, is that farmers are feeling the changes in climate, right? And they have a direct impact. What they do on the land completely impacts the climate. The studies that I've seen say 30% of greenhouse gases is agriculturally related. And so, they're seeing that they have, slower bloom times, shorter bloom times. They have more heat, more stressed plants. They can feel their yields going down. Yeah, the incredibly intense storms. And they do have crop insurance programs, but they're not really getting to where we need to get in terms of what would be a real insurance program for agriculture, in terms of how do we manage our land differently, and unfortunately that has to be led by farmers. And
I want to get into that. It reminds me, actually, there's a good documentary that came out I guess it was December 2017 or January 2017 about Wendell Berry, kind of a story of Wendell Berry's life and his. And there's a very interesting section of that documentary in which he debates Earl Butz, who was the Secretary of Agriculture at the time, at a college. I can't remember where it was. I don't know if you remember that. But in that, they had a debate, and they were almost talking two different languages. Earl Butz was all about trade deficits, industrialization to maximize America's power in the world. Really, that's what it had to do with. It had to do with Russia and China, really, in the end, and grain supplies, right? Wendell Berry was talking about rural economies. He was talking about what it takes to keep a rural economy healthy, and they were not meeting at all in what they were talking about. And what you've described, the story you're telling about what's gone on with the Farm Bill since the 1930s is it really hasn't, because we had the farm crisis in the 30s, we had a boom period, and then we had a decline, and then we had a real crisis in the 80s, and we're actually having a crisis right now. A lot of people don't know it, but the trade tariff problems, the overproduction, now the lack of payments because the government shut down. I mean, there are people going bankrupt in the Midwest today. Farms, big farms, lots of farms.
Oh, and dairy farms all over.
Yeah, and California, and California too. This is Michael. I just wanted to say how thrilled I am and excited that you're listening to Flipping the Table. These are the kinds of conversations I've wanted to share with people for a decade or more. So please like us, share with your friends, write a review, and subscribe. I'm really interested in you moving into a discussion about, yes, why are the farmers not demanding a change and thinking about how the Farm Bill could be used in new ways to end this cyclical boom, bust, failure, concentration problem we have?
Well, I mean, I do know some small scale farmers and farm activists, advocates all over, family farm advocates all over the Midwest. But I'm not a farmer myself, so I can't necessarily put myself in a farmer's shoes. And definitely, there's a whole lexicon. There's so many financial decisions that go into farming that are extremely complicated and controlled by forces beyond the farmer, like the Chicago Board of Trade, and just this whole commodity, global commodity market that if you're a corn or soybean or wheat, rice farmer, you're in.
What about the lobbyists?
And then lobbies, and big, powerful lobbies that, in my mind, the Farm Bureau is sort of like the National Rifle Association. I mean, it completely...
Talking about the National Farm Bureau.
Yeah, the National Farm Bureau has so much power.
Because California's a little, I would say, more progressive, but yeah.
Yeah, there are, state farm bureaus and then the national organization, and they have the power to make change. When I think about Wendell and that kind of conversation, I can hear Wendell Berry saying, the farming must fit the land. A good farm must fit the land, and that was an idea that really was coming out of the 30s and the 40s, and it was I wouldn't say it was an idealistic view of the farming, given the forces that were taking over. I would just say that's just a realistic, practical view of the land if it's going to stay at all productive over a certain period of time, which gets me to the next real big point, which is agriculture a public good? I kind of believe that agriculture is a public good.
Well, our policy would reflect that because it's been socialized, in the Midwest particularly.
Yeah, but then you have to figure out, but what do we get from it now? Right? And when I get to that point where I'm waiting and I'm becoming extremely impatient, having looked at the Farm Bill for many years now, for the farmers to really somehow band together and come up with another program which is truly public spirited, and that would say, okay, yes, we realize that we're more than just low price material producers for global commodities that go into animal feed and processed food and ethanol. We actually are the keepers of the soil, which is the most important resource that humanity is in charge of, and as well as the water and the air in our rural communities and the beauty of our natural landscapes and these places where we have nature that actually has a huge service to the human soul. How do we get there? And the question may be, well, maybe we have to spend more money than we're spending. I mean, we're spending $100 billion a year.
$1 trillion every 10 years.
$1 trillion every 10 years. Granted, more and more of that is being taken up by food assistance. But let's just say we're spending $25 or $30 billion a year.
Subsidizing farmers.
Yeah, this is a huge amount of money. Do we have to spend more in order to clean up the water and clean up the air and
fix the climate
and create these networks of habitats throughout the whole country that fix carbon, that pull carbon out of the atmosphere, store it into the ground, and
clean the Gulf
and begin to really change climate change to have some direct impact on it. And I think we could get creative. It's not, for me, I really think there should be no subsidization without a social obligation. Mm-hmm. And for me, it's protection of the soil. It's creating this huge buffer of habitat and underground farming, underground carbon throughout our big agricultural areas.
Mm-hmm. So, I think there are a number of people thinking along these lines now. I know, you have been moving and talking about this your third book just came out. It used to be called Food Fight. Now it is called The Farm Bill, A Citizen's Guide. And it's always been called A Citizen's Guide, but I do notice that in the past it was called Food Fight. I'm curious about the change in title. We can go to that in a minute. But, I think there are a lot more people thinking along the lines that you've been describing, that we need some sort of a diversification or broadening of the base of deliverables from the farm economy for the subsidies. And what you're talking about is a repairing of the earth. And this fits in with what I think some of the new members of Congress are talking about, the New Green Deal. I mean, this could be part of a New Green Deal, is what you're saying, it seems to me.
Yeah, I haven't been keeping up so well with all the
talk,
the platforms that are out there. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is still the legacy of the New Deal. This is one of the main things that we still have going. And imagine all of those jobs, all those projects, many things that were created from the New Deal, good and bad, and how it energized a country that was really in collapse. I would say that the rural economies are largely collapsing. I've driven across the country a number of times in the last few years, and it's kind of shocking when you get into these rural deserts of culture, so I'm not sure. I think you have to be very careful about how you sort of use it as some kind of canvas. I think these things have to come up organically.
So that gets us back to the farmers.
Yeah. It gets back to me. It's up to the rural areas to suddenly give us something different besides what feels like blackmail right now. We just have to put $30 billion out there for the corn and the soybean and the wheat farmers and a few others, just because because we need to keep these financial institutions afloat. But
Well, the lobby and the politicians want to get reelected, so they're going to go. I mean, it always happens. It's the path of least resistance. It's very hard to change policy. I mean, you see that. I see that. It's hard to change policy because the way it works now, there's a group of people that are benefiting from that policy, and it's banks, it's the people selling the pesticides, the machinery, all those people that are basically supplying the farmers want to see that money keep flowing. The question is, how do we broaden the base of people who are going to receive income from a new system? That's the challenge. I mean, so that takes a new constituency who's fighting with the farmers in those communities. But I agree, it needs to come from the farmers first. And so can you think of some folks out there that you interact with in your work that are trying to make that argument?
yeah, I would say the Practical Farmers of Iowa. I think that they've put out a pretty good platform about, farming shouldn't be designed to be done 1 month or 2 months a year from an office and a tractor. That really, managing the farm, it's a full-time job, and conservation is the basis of good farming. And that should be the basis of government support. And when you get back to it, I mean, really, our subsidized dollars, they should be there for things that the market doesn't pay for.
Correct.
Yeah. The market pays you for the lowest price. It doesn't pay you for making sure that the water's clean and the air's clean. But then if you don't do that, and if you are just serving the lowest cost, regardless of impact, then you're shifting all those burdens of those costs onto other communities in water purification, which is almost impossible in Des Moines and certain areas because of agricultural runoff, or in the Gulf of Mexico where they have this, enormous
Hypoxia, right.
zone of hypoxia.
Which is dead. Nothing can live because there's no oxygen.
The size of New Jersey. Mm-hmm. That's all really a result of farming practices in the upper Midwest flowing down the Mississippi River. I mean, we pay now or we pay later, and we pay all kinds of health burdens in rural areas too, in terms of asthma and
cancer,
bad diet-related diseases as well.
So, do you know of any policymakers in Washington D.C. that are? I know you and I have talked about, I think it's Earl Blumenauer up in Oregon. There's some other legislators who are thinking more progressively. And also you might mention years ago, I remember Wendell Berry and others were promoting this idea, and I think you were as well, a 50-year farm bill. I mean, can you wrap that in? Because what I'm trying to do is, okay, let's talk about the future. Yeah. What does the future farm bill look like if you were to craft it?
Okay, if I was to craft it, it would be very, very different than what we have today. I like very much the idea of the 50-year farm bill, which is saying that right now we have farming that is really based on perennial agriculture, which takes its toll on the soil through lots of chemicals.
Which means it's plowed every year,
perennial. It's plowed every year.
Annual crops.
Yeah, and much of it to feed animals in confinement. And so it means kind of a retro innovation of really changing the ways we produce animals for food, and getting them back on to permanent pastures. And it's obviously not going. That transformation can't take over time. But when you look at a farm bill, which is basically a 5 to 6 year investment period, public taxpayer investment period, and you extend it out over 50 years, you can make these guideposts to say, okay, we're going to transition to a completely different kind of agriculture, and this is how we're going to do it. And it's going to take research, it's going to take new infrastructure, it's
training.
I mean, it's a real far-sighted, important deal. And you can imagine that, there's 400 million acres of ag land that's being used just for cropping alone. Over the many years, if 15 years out, you impact a third of them, and then another 15 years out, you impact another 20%, that over 50 years, you could really transform the way we farm and perhaps absolutely get to those important rural revitalization movements that you mentioned before.
So the question in my mind is, with that vision, a 50-year farm bill that has guideposts that will lead us to a new paradigm for agriculture in the United States, you need political will. The question is, on the surface of it, you would say that's not practical, it's not going to happen. But going back to the beginning of this conversation about what happened in the 1930s, there was a Great Depression, and it allowed a remarkable thing to happen. The Farm Bill was written in 3 weeks, the first draft, because there was a crisis. Would you agree that the potential for climate change and what's going on with our economies could create the conditions for something as radical as that to happen again, where you could actually lay out those guideposts over 50 years and get a new kind of legislation?
I think it should, but it's going to require leadership. It's going to require someone in the Oval Office who really understands the problem of agriculture. And we don't have that right now. We haven't had that, really. I mean, look, when FDR launched the first Farm Bill, he said this is an experiment, and it's necessary to save agriculture. And if it doesn't work, I'll be the first one to take it back. Unfortunately, the genie was let out of the bottle, and it's never been put back in. So now I think really to transform agriculture, we need a president who really truly understands agriculture is a huge driver of climate change. Agriculture can potentially be a huge driver of reversing climate change, of putting carbon in the ground, of really, really using agriculture as this sponge.
A sink.
As a sink to
It's also a driver of nutritional health. I mean, that's my argument always. It's public health officials and government. We're trying to get our new Governor Newsom here in California to really focus on the farming system here in California as a driver of public health as well and nutrition.
And I think and so I believe also that there could be some really creative thinking. Okay, this is a strange one, but let's say a number of generals a number of years ago wrote this paper, 100 generals, retired generals, called "Too Fat to Fight." It was basically about this crisis in rural America that, most of the recruits come from poor areas of rural America, and increasingly they were having to reject 40, 50, 60% of the recruits because they were overweight. And then even when they got in, they had these really difficult dietary problems that started when they were young. When people were young,
pre-diabetic,
and they couldn't keep their weight down while they were in service. So just as a national defense strategy, they were trying to say, we need to reform how we feed our kids lunch at school. So what if the Defense Department, which has the biggest coffers of all of our spending, put some money toward making sure kids eat well from local farms, from good, healthy food, that's produced right here? Then there's a bucket of money. I mean, and then we have to get to the public health argument as well, which is we have an agriculture right now that arguably makes us extremely unhealthy. We're not anywhere near producing the amounts of fruits and vegetables that the USDA recommends that we eat every day. Nowhere near. And that would create a huge amount of jobs. So, I believe that there's a lot of creative thinking that could be done. And we should all be waving our wands and having some really good papers in the drawer to be sure, to be able to pass on when the right people take power.
Okay, well, so here's my final question for you. If you had power, like superpowers, and you wanted to change 1, 2, 3 things today to create the conditions to get to this 50-year farm bill and the creative thinking, what would you do?
I would as quickly as I possibly could, shift from crop insurance toward green payments. So try to find some arrangement that had deep ecological impact that would pay farmers for things that the market does not. And I think that you would have to have some kind of supply management programs to guarantee prices, to give good prices. But I would, as quickly as I possibly could, shift this whole system where we pay farmers to produce as much as they can, which in the end creates a price crisis of their own making.
Create a depression, yeah.
And shift it toward, okay, we'll pay you to make sure the water's clean. We'll pay you to make sure that there's connected habitat throughout entire, farming regions. These green belts, 100 miles long. We'll pay you to eventually, move away from this factory farm model toward integrating animals on the land back into your farming system. That to me is the only sane way ahead. Otherwise we're just throwing this money into a problem that is an avalanche.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge, and the things that I'm taking away today really are the idea of a president, and we really haven't had a president who knew that much about agriculture. I mean, even going back to FDR, he was closer to it because the whole country was closer to agriculture back then. I mean, he knew a lot more farmers probably than most of our presidents do today. They meet them when they go to Iowa, but they don't really know them. I mean, I don't think Donald Trump knows many farmers.
Jimmy Carter was a peanut farmer.
Carter, that's right. Jimmy Carter knew. But really, I mean, since FDR, he's probably the only president. Maybe I'm wrong, but I can't think of another president in our lifetime Ronald Reagan had the ranch in California, but it wasn't really a farming ranch. So I think that's an important thing. Who in the next election in 2020, of those candidates, who's going to know the most about agriculture? That's going to be an interesting question for me based on what you've said today. Also, how many Americans are going to pick up the book, The Farm Bill, A Citizen's Guide, which is just out, which it's the third edition of that book, and it's becoming the book in the campuses across the country where students increasingly are studying the food system. So it's really exciting to know that there's a whole generation. So maybe that's our great hope that I heard Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez the other day talking about the new Green Deal, and she did mention agriculture and local food systems. So it's in the consciousness of the next generation, which is good, in part because of your book and other books and other conversations and other organizations. So I have some hope, and I want to thank you very much for talking to us about the Farm Bill today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You have been listening to Flipping the Table, a podcast about food, farming, and the future. Flipping the Table is hosted by me, Michael Reed Dimmock, and produced by Patrick Sexton. Our production colleague is Doris Meyer. Our sponsors include Roots of Change and the Public Health Institute. If you have questions, comments, suggestions, or would like to sponsor Flipping the Table, please email us at comments@flippingthetable.org. That's comments@flippingthetable.org. Thank you.